Nobody in the room knew what Bruce Lee was doing. The lights were low, a projector was rolling, and the most feared martial artist in Hong Kong was standing in front of a mirror, not watching himself, but watching someone else, moving when that person moved, stopping when that person stopped, studying every step, every shift of weight, every decision made in the space between 1 second and the next. The man on the screen was Muhammad Ali, and what Bruce Lee was about to admit about him would shock everyone who thought they knew what Bruce Lee believed. Hong Kong, 1972. Bruce Lee was at the absolute peak of his public reputation. His films were breaking box office records across Asia. His name alone could fill a theater. He had built a body most people considered physically perfect and a reputation for fighting ability that had taken on almost mythological proportions. Students traveled thousands of miles just to train near him, and yet, in private, he had spent years quietly accumulating something most people around him didn't know existed, a collection of fight films belonging to a man he had never met, a boxer from Louisville, Kentucky, who moved in a way that Bruce Lee found almost impossible to fully understand. He had been studying Muhammad Ali for years, but nobody knew how deep that study actually went. The moment that revealed the depth of it happened during production on Enter the Dragon, when Bruce Lee found himself in conversation with director Robert Klaus. He described to Klaus what he had been doing privately, methodically, in the months before filming began. He had obtained film of Ali's fights and set up a wide mirror in his training space, positioning it so that Ali's image from the screen would reflect back at him as he stood in front of it, not to compare himself to Ali, not to imitate him, to follow him, to move alongside him in real time, tracing Ali's footwork with his own feet, matching Ali's head movement with his own head, trying to get inside the rhythm of the most elusive fighter alive and understand from the inside what the outside image couldn't fully explain. What Bruce Lee was looking for was something specific. Ali moved differently from anyone Lee had ever studied. The footwork wasn't just fast. It was light, in a way that created constant problems for opponents, trying to time their strikes. A floating, circular motion that ate up angles and made distance almost impossible to judge with confidence. Lee had built his entire philosophy of combat around the idea that speed and economy of movement were the highest physical virtues a fighter could develop. And here was Ali, operating at a level of movement quality that Lee had to admit in private conversations documented by people close to him, he had never encountered before. And then Bruce Lee said something that nobody expected, something that changed the way everyone who heard it understood him. He told people he would lose to Ali, not as a hypothetical, not as false modesty, as a considered analytical conclusion reached after years of studying exactly what Ali was capable of. The size difference alone was significant. Ali, standing over 6 feet and weighing more than 200 pounds in his prime, against Lee's 5'7" and 145 pounds. But Lee's concern went beyond the numbers. It was the footwork. He believed, based on his own intensive study, that Ali's ability to control distance and movement was good enough to neutralize the speed and precision that defined Lee's own approach, that no amount of striking technique could solve a man who simply wouldn't be where you expected him to be when you expected him to be there. This was not how people talked about Bruce Lee. This was not the image. The man whose 1-inch punch had sent trained fighters flying, who had built a philosophy around the idea that no external limitation could hold back a disciplined mind, was privately acknowledging that another human being represented a problem he didn't know how to solve. But this is the part that most people who repeat the story miss entirely. Bruce Lee didn't make that admission and walk away from it. He made the admission and went back to the mirror, because for him, identifying what he couldn't do wasn't defeat. It was the most useful information available. The mirror sessions with Ali's fight footage weren't acts of admiration or entertainment. They were targeted research, an attempt to extract specific principles from a movement system that Lee recognized as superior in certain domains and understand whether any of those principles could be translated into a different context. What he found, working through the footage over months, was applicable. Ali's footwork was built on a principle Lee already understood intellectually, but had not fully developed in his own movement. Constant weight redistribution, a state of perpetual readiness that made it possible to move in any direction at any moment without the brief pause of resetting that conventional stances required. Lee had been working toward this in his own training for years. The idea that a perfect fighter should be like water, taking no fixed position, offering no fixed target. Ali, without any formal philosophy attached to the description, was the purest physical expression of that idea Lee had ever observed. There was an indirect connection between the two men that most people have never heard about. Bruce Lee had a close friendship with Jun Rhee, the Korean-American martial artist, often called the father of American Taekwondo, who had trained alongside Lee and exchanged techniques with him. Rhee went on to train Muhammad Ali directly, teaching him a specific punching method that emphasized explosive non-telegraphic delivery, a technique that traced its lineage through Rhee back to principles Bruce Lee had helped develop and share. Two men who never met in person ended up connected through a chain of technique that passed from one to the other without either of them ever being in the same room. Ali's later fights, after training with Rhee, showed elements of that non-telegraphic approach. The influence had traveled from Lee to Rhee to Ali, completing a circuit that nobody designed and nobody fully knew existed. Bruce Lee died in July 1973, before Enter the Dragon was released, before he could ever see whether the global platform the film would give him might eventually have produced the meeting with Ali that never happened in his lifetime. Ali lived until 2016. In the decades after Lee's death, Ali acknowledged knowing of him, but spoke with characteristic humor about hypothetical matchups, making clear he didn't see Lee as a genuine physical threat, given the weight differential. He had no reason to. What he didn't know, because nobody told him, was that the man he was dismissing had spent years in a darkened room with a mirror, trying to learn from him, had admitted in private that Ali represented a problem he couldn't solve, had respected that enough to study it with the same systematic rigor he brought to everything else in his life. Bruce Lee never chased Ali's approval or his recognition. He chased understanding. And in the process, he left behind a record of a great mind, doing what great minds do, not celebrating what they already know, but going to the deepest possible effort to understand what they don't. The mirror is still the most honest part of the story. Not the hypothetical fight, not the speculation about who would win. The image of a man who had nothing left to prove, standing alone in a room at night, following the movements of someone he had never met and would never meet, because the movement was worth understanding. That's what Bruce Lee looked like when nobody was watching. And it turns out that version of him was more impressive than any version the camera ever caught.